People can hear me? Okay, good. So thank you for having me here this afternoon. My name is Susan Crane. I often go by Sue, which you see on the PowerPoint. And my title at Lifespan is Care Manager and Educator. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lifespan. I suspect several of you are. So Lifespan is an organization. It's based in Rochester, New York. And our mission is to help serve older adults in many different fashions. So I have colleagues that work with older adults that are dealing with addiction. I have colleagues who are working with older adults who need help with long-term financial planning. I have other colleagues that actually man the 211 hotline that's available here in New York State. I have other colleagues that work on elder abuse issues. I am part of the Finger Lakes Caregiver Institute. So our program is funded specifically by the Department of Health of New York State. And I work with people who are helping others to deal with memory loss. So my job is usually working with mostly family members, but sometimes not, sometimes friends, neighbors, long distance relatives to help care for somebody else who has some type of memory loss issue. Does not mean an official diagnosis, doesn't mean just, it just means a challenge. What's a little bit more unique about me specifically is I work in conjunction with the Memory Center at Rochester Regional Health. So I work with the two physicians there, Dr. Bruns and Dr. Gill, and then they have physician's assistant, Matt Smith. I work very closely with them. They send referrals over to me, and I work with family members of those patients. So the clients I work with, the memory loss issues kind of range. So I do have clients whose loved one they're caring for does have Parkinson's. Alzheimer's usually the biggest bulk of the clients I work with, but also other types of dementia. Lewy bodies is another one they have a little bit of a specialty in, frontal temporal, some aphasias, and very often I have clients where they have two dementia issues at once. They might have vascular dementia and Alzheimer's, or Parkinsonism and Lewy bodies. It's a big mix. And that is my role. I've been in it about a year. And prior to that, I was working as a director of a team in New York City. So I'm actually originally from New York City. I moved back up here in about 2017 to go for my social work degree. I also have a degree in public administration, along with a communications undergraduate. So let's see if I can advance this. Okay, so when I was asked to do this talk, this is a talk I've given before to another caregiver group that we have here at Lifespan. And we were looking to provide some discussion. I mean, it centers a lot around what's going on now in the world of COVID, but it's not just applicable to the experiences now with the pandemic. So I'm going to talk about dealing with uncertainty, but in I'd say a less general term. I'm going to basically use myself as a case study. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal experiences with various disasters over the years. I'll talk a little bit about what my life is like right now, living in Rochester while there's a pandemic going on. I will address a little bit of what we have heard from other caregivers prior to this talk. I think there'll be some similarities. I will address a big topic I usually talk about with families is this idea of ambiguous grief, and about managing stress and anxiety, actually differentiating between those two things. They often get lumped together and they're actually two different things. I will talk about my personal experiences with them and how I address them. And then there'll definitely be some time at the end for Q&A. I'm thinking there'll be a couple other natural break points where we might stop and just let you guys ask me any questions. So I'm just going to move forward. So let's see, that's now. So I'm going to talk about past. So I originally grew up in New York City. And when in 2001, I actually was living in New York City and I worked in downtown Manhattan. And was there when September 11th attack happened at the World Trade Center. I worked for a nonprofit that ran a good government group. So we had a hotline every day for primaries and other election days. So actually all my colleagues and I were there for the attack and then the aftermath. So with that one, even though that affected my work life, less my family life. Luckily, my family was all in Staten Island. I have parents, a younger sister. They were all in Staten Island, nowhere near what was going on. I didn't have to worry about their safety. But my office was displaced for roughly 6 weeks. So we had to, as an organization, figure out how to work together while nobody was in the same place, which was very different from work life prior to that. And then after that, we actually had to deal with the economic issues. We were a small nonprofit and we had to rely on donations. And I will say that after 2001, it was a little tough to get those donations. We did well for a while, but eventually I did experience a layoff. I was downsized. Took longer because of my role at the time, but eventually I did have to find new work. So that was 2001. That was very traumatic, to say the least, and very personally tough. And then I moved on to work for an organization in New York City that recruited volunteers, and their job was to send teams of volunteers out to work with other nonprofits in New York City. I was a director of a team, and I had many different types of programs under my purview. I had children, I had older adults, I had people living with chronic illnesses, I had large parks. I mean, it was pretty big. So when Hurricane Superstorm Sandy came, I had a role. We were the organization the city was partnering with to deal with those volunteers that decide to just show up out of the blue after some natural disaster. So while we were getting ready for that to go on, we, at that time, where I lived in Staten Island again, I was with my family. My younger sister by then was married and was pregnant and was living closer to the coastline than I was. And while I was trying to work, my sister was getting flooded out of her home and had to basically run for her life to her landlord's house. My mother is like, want to get a boat and we have to go try to get my sister, and I'm trying to figure out a way to get a boat. So that experience of working during a natural disaster while something is going on with my family that is very difficult was also going on at the same time. So I kind of definitely was feeling pulled in two very, very different directions. So those are my past experiences. I also did go to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina to help with some of the rebuilding stuff. That was about a year after the storm. So I was getting to see how, like, a year out from a major disaster, how things still were not in good shape. I mean, I was in a neighborhood that a year after still had no running water, had no electricity, had a very few people living back in their homes. Most people who were there were living in trailers on the property because they were trying to rebuild their homes basically from scratch. So that's past. All of those have kind of informed how I would say each one informs the next one for me. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on for me right now. Okay, so COVID appears. I will say that because my family and a good chunk of the people that I'm close with are still in New York City, I was pretty aware of what was going on, maybe a little sooner than others. So my family is in New York City. I'm in Rochester. That's very different this time. Last times I've been with them. And that has definitely been a challenge. My father in the past 6 weeks, unfortunately, has had to have emergency surgery. He is a type 2 diabetic. He had an infection. He had to have emergency surgery. And then last week he tested positive for COVID. So yeah, that's great. So that is going on with my family, and I can't be with them at all. I can't go and see them for various reasons. For a while, it was a question of, well, I'm doing essential work. I am still in the community. I am out delivering food to people. I am delivering prescriptions to people. I don't really know whether or not I'm interacting with anybody who has this virus. So the fear was I would bring it down. And now we're in the reverse, where my father definitely has it. And my mother thankfully has tested negative so far, but we can't go to him because he can expose us. So we're kind of in a conundrum. So we're kind of having to wait it out. The other big challenge for me is this time I'm actually living by myself. And many of the normal activities that I've started to do when I decided to stay in the Rochester area after getting my social work degree, I can't do. You know, I can't see many of the friends I have. I am unable to do, you know, my walking club was a group of people I met with every week. Can't do that right now. I was in a choral group. Can't do that right now, you know, and there's only so many Zoom meetings you can go to and Zoom meetups. So that is what things are going on for me right now. So once again, it's a little challenging. Although I would say past disasters do make me a little bit more cognizant of what's going on with me internally. Everyone is different. Every disaster is different. And I would say this feels like a combination of Hurricane Sandy and September 11th thrown together, which I didn't think would be possible, but here we are now. So these are definitely some of the emotions I've experienced, and I would say that I've heard others express, but I would also want to clarify, it's not just related to the pandemic. I would say that I've heard these words used by people who are caring for others with memory loss and for the people who are also experiencing the memory loss themselves. There's that huge feeling of uncertainty and feeling of unsafe. With the pandemic, it does be it's a little bit more specific because there's so many unknowns. You know, from day to day, you could wake up and the information that you thought was good and well and clear yesterday is completely upended. You know, one day Tylenol's okay with the pandemic, one day Advil's not okay, then it switches, and then it doesn't switch, and then you're like, I don't know what to do. I've definitely heard people say that they're angry. I've definitely been pretty mad a couple of times myself. I would like to go see my family. I typically was seeing them roughly every 6 weeks. I have not seen them since the end of January. That is pretty long for me. I was not able to go for Easter. I was not able to go for Mother's Day. I was not able to go for Memorial Day. I'm hoping for Father's Day. Don't know right now. And, you know, not being able to make that plan is really frustrating for me. I've definitely experienced feeling lonely. I live alone right now, like I said, but, you know, not being able to see people day to day. It's a little bit different than when I first gave this talk. We've gone from having only 25% of people in the office to about 50%. So I've gotten to see more people, but I'm seeing them in just a work environment. That's different from when you go home. Boredom. People are definitely telling me they're bored. My girlfriend this morning was texting me being like, I am bored out of my mind. And I'm like, yeah, sometimes I'm bored too. And then there's grief. You know, I'm going to talk about ambiguous grief, but then there's other grief. Thankfully, you know, my father, for the most part, has been okay in terms of health symptoms from COVID, and the surgery went very smoothly comparatively. But, you know, that idea of having to like not know, being really scared and like, you know, almost anticipatory grief of like losing something or losing someone. And I would say that we're all in some ways grieving for the life that we once had prior to COVID. And I would argue that anyone who is dealing with some type of memory loss, or some type of chronic health issue does grieve for the life that they had prior to that diagnosis. And you might also notice changes in others' behavior, you know, change in how people relate to you, how people are relating to each other. I used to also, prior to this position, I was an intern at the Wilmot Cancer Center at U of R, and I definitely heard patients tell me that as soon as they told others that they had cancer, the way others related to them changed. And that was really upsetting because for them, you know, even though they might be feeling ill or they might be, you know, experiencing side effects from chemotherapy, they were still the same person underneath, they felt, but others were treating them differently. And it was really frustrating and upsetting. And it felt like it was dismissing their ability, the abilities that they did still have, even though they had a chronic illness. So one thing you might have noticed beyond, you know, changes you might have seen because of memory loss issues is that people in general are like less friendly or less available. Or one person that mentioned to me prior to this talk, like, oh, I thought that person was totally together. Yeah, they're not doing well. I would say the thing to remember is that collectively, society has been asked to change personal behavior in a way that is so different from the norm in order to benefit public health. And people are making decisions with the information they have available. And to be frank, not all the choices are great. Like there's no great choice. There's no rule book of how to live during a pandemic. Nobody's dealt with this before. Well, I mean, there may be some, but in general, people have not had to deal with this before. And everyone has had to come up with their own rule book on how to be safe and how to feel safe. And you might be experiencing conflicts where what you think you need to do in order to be safe conflicts with what somebody else thinks they need to do in order to be safe. And there's where you might have that issue of arguments. You know, I definitely seen people's tempers be a little less, to be a bit shorter. Throw on some out of seasonal heat onto the mix, and then I'm sure people are feeling the heat and the humidity, and they're also reacting to the, you know, so many different and unusual things going on at the same time. So that's kind of something to keep in mind, particularly when you're interacting with people right now, as things start to like open, quote unquote, open up a little bit. And, you know, once again, everybody's trying to figure out how to navigate a relatively new world. So I want to stop right now before I go into ambiguous grief and see if anybody had any questions. Okay, I think we'll just move on then. So the one thing I often talk with families about when they're dealing with memory loss, and maybe an official diagnosis of dementia, Alzheimer's, Lewy bodies, something along those lines, is this idea of ambiguous grief. So there's grief, you know, there's loss and grief that people feel after a death, as it's kind of an end of something. It's an official ending to a thing. But ambiguous loss can be experienced kind of before that death, because it's a weird space. You know, the person who may have a chronic illness that will likely end in maybe a life limiting disease, will still physically be there, but over time, the person disappears in a way. I've had, very often I hear from spouses is that, you know, it's somewhere in the point of caregiving, they say, this is not the person I married. You know, the person I married is not there anymore, but that person's physical body and to some extent, you know, some type of personality is still there. And it's an odd feeling because from the outside, you know, from outside folks, maybe not the people who are involved in the day-to-day caregiving, but like maybe relatives who only see the person every couple of months, or, you know, friends or something like that. It's hard for them to understand how you might be experiencing a level of grief when the person is still around. And you might hear sometimes like, oh, every day is precious, you should appreciate things, like those platitudes. And I've had many caregivers tell me they really don't want to hear that kind of stuff on many days. So I do like to talk about this because it, I think, gives maybe a definition to what they're feeling. There is a very good booklet I have, I'm happy to share with people, that addresses ambiguous grief. And I've had many caregivers choose to share it, maybe, you know, very often it's usually spouses, sharing it with their children to help them understand how mom or dad is feeling about the loss that they've experienced to having their partner no longer be who they were. And it's also important that to remember everybody grieves loss or losses in his or her own way, and that the feeling that ambiguity is valid, and that it's important to voice it and to talk about it, because, you know, with all emotions, if you hold it in long enough, eventually it's going to come out in some way, and not always very positive or healthy. I would say healthy is the best way to kind of think about that. So I now want to move on a little bit talking about stress and anxiety. So stress and anxiety often get lumped together. Stress is something where something you care about is at stake, and it generally includes the perception of danger. And some signs of stress are chest tightness, sleeping issues, restlessness, inability to relax, digestive issues. The one thing you'll notice is that all those signs usually have a physiological component to it. Anxiety is a little different in that it's an unhelpful thinking pattern that occurs when one's mind fixates on threat, uncertainty, and negativity. So you will see some examples of anxiety is threat scanning, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, worry, hypothetical worrying, emotional reasoning, and fortune telling. So the thing for me is that because of my experiences at September 11th, I definitely have a diagnosis of PTSD that amplified some probably existing anxiety issues I had. And it took me a while to figure out what the heck was going on. Prior to September 11th, I had never really thought very much about my mental health. I was 26 at the time, so I was a couple of years out of college. I will say freshman year of college was difficult for me. It was a difficult transition, but never thought of it as like, you know, a mental health issue that just wasn't addressed. I will say after September 11th, I experienced flashbacks, I experienced nightmares, I experienced constant threat scanning is definitely something I experienced. I have learned since then I'm very noise sensitive. So for a long time, my startle response to noise was very, very heightened and exaggerated. So like a very simple, like a firecracker, some people might turn their heads at the firecracker sound, but know it's a firecracker right away. I would jump out of my seat. I would be like just immediately flashing back. And I will say, let's see, of the examples of anxiety, my personal, the one I usually like to go to is fortune telling. You know, I can see the future, I can predict the future. And I definitely have some black and white thinking going on, which that one took me a long time to figure out. I will say, as a director, I oversaw a team. I had to hire and fire people all the time. My boss one time mentioned to me, she says, most of the time you're fine, you know, you work well with your team, but every once in a while, one of your team does a small thing and you have all of a sudden you go from, we can work it out, to that person needs to go. And she's like, I don't know where that comes from. And I was like, oh, I don't know where that comes from either. I need to work on that. So those are my quote unquote personal favorites. So if you find yourself kind of in that space of like stress and anxiety, and you're experiencing, you know, you're really having trouble focusing and kind of dealing with day-to-day stuff, then usually the best thing to start with is like physical, like the things you actually have control over at that day. You know, I think there's been a lot of talk now, particularly with COVID and isolation, about mental health and addressing mental health. So, you know, sometimes your anxiety and stress can make you very unable to focus, unable to get through your day. And you then have to kind of start dealing with maybe physical things first. Stress and anxiety can be exacerbated by not eating well, not drinking well, not sleeping well, not getting exercise, not having outdoor time. So the first step usually is to try to figure out what you actually have control over on that day. So kind of going through a mental list. So this is a question, you know, if I'm feeling stress and anxiety, I might say, have I eaten today? Okay, what have I eaten today? I know personally that if I don't eat protein in the morning, I'm going to end up with a wicked headache at like 1 o'clock, and I'm not going to be able to focus for the rest of the day. Have I drank water? With this heat in particular, more liquid is important. Have I done anything that I like to do today? And that doesn't matter what that is. It can be watching TV. It can be going outside. It can be reading a book. It doesn't matter. It's more about something that you enjoy. Have you been able to get exercise? Have you been able to go outside? Have you been able to connect with others in some capacity? So that's kind of like you're dealing with the physical part first, because that connects to the mental health part. Now, once you dealt with the physical part, then you might want to start dealing with the emotions you're having and the challenging emotions. So what you see on the screen here is a feelings chart. And there's many different versions of these out in the world. If you Google feelings chart, you will find variations of this. This one I liked because of the multiple layers it has. So you'll see in the center, there's the 6 like base feelings, and then it kind of spreads out. Because sometimes it's tough to figure out like what is going on with you, how you feel. And someone might say, oh, you seem stressed. Can you tell me what's wrong, or what are you feeling? The answer might be, I don't know. I have no idea how I feel right now. I find when I'm in that space, sometimes I look at this and I might be able to like say, oh, I am feeling overwhelmed and I'm feeling disillusioned. And that can kind of help me work back to some of those baseline feelings. This comes from a type of mental health work called DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy. I work with a counselor one-on-one, and this is some of the work that we do together. Is when I'm unable to give my emotions a name, she says, well, then check your emotional wheel, and let's see if we can kind of dig down a little bit and get yourself back to the base, so you know how to deal with it. So once you figure out that emotional part, I think the key thing to remember, or even if you can't come up with like a very specific, naming of the emotion, I think it's important to remember that regardless of what it is not going to last forever. And that, for me personally, I find very helpful, especially when I'm feeling very anxious. Because if I can remember that feeling is not going to last forever, it helps. It will end at some point. It may not end for another hour or two, but it's going to end. So that helps me to be able to stay kind of hopeful, is probably the way I would describe it. And it also helps me not to try to suppress it, not to kind of push the anxiety away, because when you do that, it usually comes back stronger and harder and tougher to deal with. So, suppressing your emotions is not usually a good plan. Now, a caveat, it's not possible to express every single emotion as you're feeling it in the time, in an appropriate place. So I understand there are times when you're going to feel something and it's not the appropriate place to express them, but acknowledging at that moment. So if you are feeling it, but you can't do anything else about it, acknowledging it, like, I feel really angry right now. And then usually the acknowledgement will help a little bit to get you through that moment until you can later deal with that emotion in a more appropriate or private setting. So I will tell you, I've tried surfing. I did not look like either of these people in my surfing extravaganzas, but it's a dream. One day I might look like one of these people. So some techniques I have in order to kind of deal with the anxiety and kind of get me through the moment. One is called a 5-4-3-2-1 breathing technique. So what you do is you take a breath in, and usually it's with the 5 senses. So the 5 typically is see. So name 5 things that you can see. 4, and then you let your breath out. You do 4. Usually look for 4 things that you can hear. Let the breath out. 3 tends to be maybe smell. 2 might be touch, and 1 might be taste. So the idea is you're using your 5 senses to eventually ground you. Very often with anxiety, what happens is that you are no longer in your space and no longer in the moment. You're either thinking about the future or worrying about the past, or you're not there. And the idea behind that breathing technique is to bring you back into the moment, which is all you really can, in theory, deal with and control. Another breathing technique is square. It's called square breathing. I also sometimes call it rectangle thinking. You can even do it with your computer to monitor. So what you do is you take a breath in and you use your eye to trace along the top of the computer monitor. And then your exhale is for one side, and then you inhale again across the bottom of the computer monitor, and then exhale up the other side. And you can do that almost in any space in the world. Almost any space in the world, you look around and there are squares and rectangles somewhere. So the idea is to use your eye. Once again, it's grounding you into the space that you're in at that moment. And kind of, very often people with anxiety, if you've ever experienced it, usually your breathing becomes much more rapid and you start to almost tip into hyperventilation. It's a way to slow your breathing and slow yourself down. Once those things get addressed, I usually deal with the idea of like, what can I control for 5 minutes? And some things can be, I can, if I'm at work, you know, I can clean up this little section of my desk for 5 minutes. I can go open a door or a window in my apartment, get a glass of water, I wash my face. Another thing I'll do is, depending where you are, is take your shoes off and actually place your feet on the floor or outside in grass. And that, once again, is the idea of bringing yourself back to being more grounded. I will tell you, I've done every single one of these if I'm having anxiety issues. And what I often tell people is, you need to build your toolbox. You need to build all these up. And you're going to find some days you might only have to do one of these techniques. Some days you might have to do all of them. And unfortunately, there might be 1 or 2 days where you do all these and it just doesn't help in the moment. And that is really a challenging day. And that's when you have to go back to the idea of, I'm going to ride this out. I'm going to ride this wave of emotion out. So if I'm noticing like there's strings of days in a row where I'm dealing with a lot of anxiety, I start paying attention to what information I'm taking in. I will tell you, at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, watching the numbers go up in terms of cases, particularly in New York City, was really, really, you know, hard for me because I was worrying about friends and family. I learned, all right, you can only do one look at the newspaper in the morning and maybe watch part of the governor's daily press conference and maybe like one part of the evening news. And there were days where I only did one of those. There were other days where I did none of those. But I was trying to be conscientious of how much information I was taking in, because the conflicting messages sometimes was just too overwhelming. I would make sure I'm doing activities that are engaging, but a little bit more on the mindless side. So I'm a big knitter. I can knit without really thinking hard about it, but it has enough distraction in my brain that I will, it's soothing for me. So doing those types of activities. And then also choosing to trust people. I'm lucky enough to have people in my life that know about my past anxiety challenges and my experiences and are supportive. And those are the people I go to, and I don't have to tell them my story over and over again. There are a couple of people where I'll say, I am not doing well today. And I'm just not doing well. And that's usually all I needed to hear like, I'm sorry you're not having a great day. And that was enough. And then there were other days where I needed to talk more to somebody. Like I mentioned earlier, I do have a professional mental health therapist I work with. I've been working with someone pretty much off and on since like 2016, both in New York City and up here. And I think it's made a huge difference in my life, but it's not for everybody. I know individual therapy is not for everybody. But I do want to talk a little bit about when it might be time to seek out professional help. So you'll see these 5 common signs of anxiety, and the idea is that you might have one of these or multiple of these things going on. So difficulty concentrating, restlessness, irritability, sleep disturbance, a lot of muscle tension. And it's not so much like a day of that happening or even like a week of that happening, but like continuously happening. So if you've been noticing like it's a month and I'm only getting 2 good nights of sleep a week, and I'm really restless and I'm really cranky and I'm always tense and I can't concentrate, that's when it might be time to seek out some professional help to work through these anxieties and stress issues. And that can take in many different forms. And the other thing I think is really important, particularly when dealing with memory loss issues and chronic illnesses and life, is that it's important to be as non-judgmental about yourself and others as possible. So there are going to be days when you're just not going to have it in you to be everything you want to be for yourself and the person you're caring for. So that's okay. You can't be 100% all the time. It's not possible. When I gave this talk originally, I will be frank, pretty much all my meals had bacon in it for a while, and I was eating a lot of Cheetos. And that was okay. That's what I needed to do at that time. And it's all right when that kind of stuff happens. And it's okay when you notice that your patience with people is much shorter than it normally is. It's okay that you don't want to interact with every single person who wants to interact with you, particularly now. I mean, I've heard from people during COVID that I haven't heard from in a while, and I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this. We haven't talked in like 15 years. I don't know if I really need to talk to you. Now, there are some people who I was thrilled to hear from, and some people I was like, So learning how to say no to some things is important, and not to judge yourself for saying no to some things. You are the controller of your well-being and of your life. So it's okay to say that is not going to help me. It may make you feel better, but it's not going to help me. So I don't think I'm going to do it right now. So, some longer ways I've done to address anxiety. So I talked about the counseling. I have also used medications to help with anxiety issues. I have a book that I use to track habits. So that gets back to that physical part I was talking about. That was about whether or not I've eaten a vegetable, usually for me, because I'm not a big fan of the veggies. So I might look at my tracking habit grid and be like, it's been like 3 days since I've had a vegetable. Maybe I want to eat something better than the bacon I just talked about. I might feel a little better. And I do try to practice a gratitude thanking every day. So kind of thinking through my day and like, what am I thankful for? And it can be really small. There have been days where I'm happy that, I got to talk to my dad for 15 minutes and he sounded healthy, or he sounded more engaged than he had been in quite a while. I'm thankful that I made it through the 2-mile hike I planned and didn't fall and hurt myself, which I have done before. So that's, just trying to find something to be thankful for every day. And particularly now, COVID's not going away, unfortunately, and chronic illness doesn't go away. It just doesn't. So the idea of a new normal, some people embrace that idea, some people hate that idea. It's very personal. I'm not a fan of it. It's okay. I understand the concept. But for me, what that meant was, once I realized like, COVID's not going away. We're going to have to deal with this for a while. I'm not going to be able to see my family for a while. I'm not going to be, every year we went to the Jersey Shore for the summer, part of the summer. That's not going to happen. So that stuff is not going to happen. So what can I do to maybe move forward to some of the things I had wanted to do for this spring and summer? So that is my new dog, Brody. I just adopted him about 3 weeks ago. And he is something I've wanted to do for a while, and I kept putting it off and being like, oh, it's not a good time. How am I going to do this? And then I was like, there's never going to be a good time. And if I want this, I'm going to have to do this. So I did. And we like to go on hikes. He's currently at doggy daycare today. And he's a thing that he's something I'm really enjoying right now. On the flip side, I also originally had planned to move to a different apartment in Rochester. But after consideration of like what the world is like and the fact that I can't go and do physical visits to an apartment right now, my brain was like, don't give someone a lot of money for an apartment you haven't seen. We're going to put that off for a while. So it's kind of making some choices based on the information I have right now, and that's kind of how I've been functioning. So that is my talk, and I'd be happy to take questions if anybody has any.
The dog doing it. Susan, this is Gail. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Gail.
Okay. What I notice, it's less a question than an observation. I noticed that many of these techniques, which are really good, I can also introduce my husband who has Parkinson's and Parkinson's dementia. I can introduce some of these things to him slowly when he becomes anxious. And they're not huge. They don't take a lot of book learning. They're pretty simple. And I know how deep breathing can be really helpful. And Ellie, if you're out there, Ellie Severud mentioned this once, and that really helped her a lot. And that's where I kind of got my push to make use of those in a stressful situation, especially dealing with my husband's needs. And it's 9 o'clock, and my need is sit in the chair and do nothing at the time, but I have to do something because he has a need. So the deep breathing helps me to, you know, like you said, this too will pass. We will get through this half hour, whatever it takes to do whatever needs to be done. So I have found that very helpful. Or else if I don't do the breathing as I'm walking down the hall, it is not the wife he was used to then, because what he gets is a raging bull or lion. But the breathing calms me down enough so I give him the kindness he deserves.
Yeah, the whole point of the techniques I talked about is for them to be easy and simple, because particularly when you're experiencing anxiety, like your higher levels of thinking is kind of out the window for a bit. And if you try to incorporate something or use a technique that is a lot of mental work in the beginning when you're trying to address the anxiety, it's very difficult to do. Within like cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, there is a lot of worksheets that exist, and I will tell you, some of those are like really, you got to sit there and think for like 20 minutes to get through some of those questions, and that's just not realistic for a lot of people, and particularly people with memory loss who are already dealing with so many challenges. Like, you know, introducing something that complicated is not going to get the result that you want. So easier is better in my brain for
Susan, this is Pat Smith. And what I want to interject here is that I can commiserate with what you're dealing with right now from a different position. My husband has had Parkinson's, been diagnosed since 2002. He is in assisted living. He went into lockdown on March 10th, which means no one can visit him. We have taken him out. They do take him out for rides and some of these things. He's in a small situation. So anyway, that is similar to you're not being able to see your family. So we're both sort of doing something similar, because I mean, he's closer to me than your family is, but I can't go visit him. I can talk to him on Zoom. I can talk to him on the telephone or whatever. Separate from that, another thing that's similar is that in that same time frame, I listed our house for sale because I'm now living alone as you are, and the house is too big. But because of the real estate situation, I too can only see things in a virtual way, which is not very productive. And so everything is on hold. So I'm not complaining about it. I'm just looking at the parallel there.
Mhm.
that we're dealing with similar things, but for different reasons. And so I
Yeah.
appreciate your input.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the not seeing my family, I mean, I have clients up here who have family members, loved ones in some type of facility and they haven't been able to see them. And I've also had family members who their loved one probably does need like 24-hour care and they are not, they're not in a rush to do it. And as a social worker, as somebody who, is trying to be there for them and support them in their decisions, I totally get why they would not want to have their loved one go into a facility for not only, not being able to see them, but because once that virus unfortunately gets into the facility, it's really hard to control and it's really hard to deal with. And they're terrified. So I had one client, her husband went in like the 17th of March. Literally the next day, everything was closed off. She couldn't see him. They hadn't been apart in 30 years. She was able to do 2 weeks and then she was like, bring him home. I can't do this anymore. And she brought him home. And I was like, all right, you're going to bring him home. Like, we're going to help you figure out how to deal with this. And then we can deal with whether or not you want to have him move into a higher level care later. But yeah.
Well, this particular facility only has 6 or 7 people.
Okay.
It's in a Victorian home in a small town. The people are very caring. The only issue with my husband is he's a very social person. And so he needs people to socialize with. So we have now decided, we tried to do through one of their activities, we tried to do a Zoom of the activity with him, but it was, he has a little bit of dementia, but very little. But it was too confusing. So we're now working with people, starting with a good friend and colleague of his who lives in Princeton, setting up one-on-one Zoom calls. And the ones that have happened so far have been really good. My husband has some speech issues because of Parkinson's. The gentleman in Princeton has hearing issues, but somehow with electronics, we were able to fix it. So they had a delightful time. And so some of that is helpful. And so now he's reconnecting with people he hasn't connected with in some time. So,
that's good. That's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. But anyway, I wish you well in dealing with what you're dealing with, and it'll take away some of what you're sharing with us for my own needs.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
You're welcome.
Hello. Nope.
What are you doing?
I don't know what I'm doing. I had a question. Could I ask?
Yes, go for it, Judy.
I'm just curious about. I've had a lot of new feelings since all this began. The isolation seems to have pointed out certain areas that I'd never experienced before. For example, when I'm isolated and not having much social interaction, and I sort of think have a social kind of predilection. Now I feel like I don't want to socialize. And when you mentioned that it was okay not to want to talk to people, I've been struggling with that a lot. I just don't want to interact. And I guess it worries me because it seems uncharacteristic, number one, and number two, I'm worried it'll get worse. Because I don't know what's driving it. It's not fear, it's not stress, it's not anxiety, but it's just maybe I need a real rest, who knows?
You might need a real rest. I mean, that is definitely something. So I am a very social person. I've always been a very social person. And my counselor and I talked extensively about that part of my personality and what drives it. And not in the like, it's a bad thing or a good thing. It was more of like, what drives that? What is that question? It's more about what counseling is about for me, is the questioning. And I would say a portion of it, of that socialization constant need, is maybe it was being used to avoid me thinking about maybe some more challenging and unpleasant things. And, you know, part of it is like, oh, maybe you're right. Like that moment of like, oh, you might be right. So prior to COVID, what her and I were working on was me not waking up on a Saturday and feeling the need to do 20 things. Like to have the list ready to go, wake up Saturday morning, go and hit the ground running, and basically do all these things before work starts on Monday. And she was like, how about you just try sitting still for an hour? And I was like, okay, fine, no problem.
You're crazy.
Thinking it's easy. For me, it was not as easy, and that was a little bit telling. And we spent some time kind of dealing with why was it so difficult for me, and does that mean there are things in my life I need to address? The answer was a little bit, and learning how not to say yes to everything. And there was that fear of missing out was something I was experiencing. I think with everybody being forced to isolate, the idea of missing out is no longer there because nobody's missing out on anything right now.
Well, nobody else.
So you might find yourself with time on your hands and you're like, this isn't so bad. All right, I was gonna chill out for a while. It's, to others, it may seem odd because that's not what you as a person have portrayed out to others, but maybe right now it's a change in you. That might happen. People definitely come through large scale events different. I will tell you, my father told me about a year after September 11th, one day, I have no idea what prompted it. One day he just said, you're not the same person anymore. He's like, you're still my daughter. You're still this, you're still this, you're still this. He's like, but you are different. This may just mean you're going to be different. Because you're dealing with someone in your life who has, or yourself has, a chronic life-threatening illness, and there's also a pandemic. Like, that's a lot. So for anybody who comes out saying to me that didn't change themselves at all, I would be questioning. You know, they might not have realized it yet, but I would be like, I wonder. We'll see what happens. Maybe it'll be different in 6 months, but I highly doubt you would come through it without having nothing change.
If it changes, I suppose it's okay.
Yes. The answer is yes, it is all okay. As long as you don't, I think if you've never, I don't know, I can't speak for yourself, but I'm aware of when I need a rest because my work is stressful and some other things are going on, when I need a mental rest and a physical rest, versus I am self-isolating because I really don't feel well and I don't want to bother anybody with my feelings. Those are two different things. And I will tell you that that's work. You know, figuring out the differences is work. And it does mean you have to examine internally for a while.
I see. Yeah, very good suggestion.
Well, Susan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just want to thank you for filling in for your colleague at the last minute and,
No problem.
and coming to our aid. I really do appreciate, we've enjoyed your program today. And I think I have a copy of your notes
Yep.
that I can, hopefully we can distribute to everyone.
Yes. And I think in the notes, the link for the feelings wheel is in there, but I mean, if you Google feelings wheel, a whole bunch of them will come up. I've had people tell me they've printed it out. So I have it printed out, and actually it's on my, it's at my desk.
Okay.
Like, not really in my eyesight, but on the side. So every once in a while I'm like, you know, I'm feeling something. I don't know what it is. And I look over, I'm like, oh, I'm feeling that right now. It's a way to give words to something and you don't have to think so hard to figure it out.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you. And Alexis, thank you for your help at the library.
Yes.
Very much.
Thank you very much, Alexis.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see everybody.
Good to see everybody. Have a good day.
Goodbye.